Hello, my name is Jason Linville. This is JS110 Introduction to Forensic Sciences, the course. This lecture is on forensic psychology, and it's being recorded in the summer of 2017. So if you're accessing this archived lecture in a future semester, all of the material still applies, but if I mention anything about the summer of 2014, quizzes, exams, current events, I don't know what's going on right now, everything, then you can ignore all that and just focus on the material. Okay, so when we're talking about forensic psychology, if I can bring up my little pen here, it's going to be a little bit different from, well, it's going to be different from the lectures that we used, that we did in the beginning of the course where we're talking about different types of evidence. And this is going to be somewhat similar to our recent lectures on different professions. Like we've already had forensic anthropology, forensic entomology in the summer of 2017. You're watching that lecture this week as well. And you'll notice with these professions, the analysis of evidence tends to type down, and sometimes we'll have class characteristics and individual characteristics. Like for the mock case questions, it's possible that you have an entomology question on there where I'll ask you to compare some data to a chart. It's possible that you'll have a forensic anthropology question on there, because when we talked about identifying individuals, we talked about the class characteristics, like race and sex, and also some individual characteristics like scars and surgical procedures and stuff like that. Okay, so those will be on the mock case questions. For the forensic psychology, we're really not going to talk about anything that you're going to find as a mock case question. Excuse me, Melanie has corrected me. It's the summer of 2017. I may have said the summer of 2014. All right, so it's and I predict the president will be Donald Trump. There, are you shocked? I got it correct. So it's the summer of 2017. And all of this stuff, and we're going to talk about this in the lecture. Again, not on mock case questions. So it's, and also the history of this lecture in the textbook, forensic psychology used to be divided into 4 chapters. Like there was one on serial killers, one on profiling, one on forensic psychiatry, one on forensic psychology, and it was really just a mess. They have since condensed it down into one chapter, but it's still where you'll notice section by section, it just seems like the sections have nothing to do with one another. And in a way that's somewhat representative of the field of forensic psychology, in that there are so many subspecialties and so many areas that you can focus on. It's rare for a person to be a forensic psychologist, like that one guy on Special Victims Units. Like they brought him in to do anything forensic psychology related. And it's usually where a forensic psychologist will specialize in either, eyewitness testimony. They may specialize in determining, competency to stand trial. They may work in corrections, determine whether people are eligible for parole or should be, rehabilitated and are eligible parole. And then there are also, profilers, which I think maybe gets the most public recognition, but is sort of a small subsection of forensic psychology. And for all these different areas, there are somewhat varying levels or varying degrees of education that you need to get into the field. You can, with a master's in psychology or bachelor's of psychology, you may be able to work in corrections or serve as a counselor or something like that. Whereas if you're testifying, if it's something like eyewitness testimony, as we're going to see, and you're testifying on a lot of research done in the field, then you tend to be a research scientist and have a PhD. So there's just so many different areas. We're going to try to give you a quick overview of what forensic psychology is, and then I will try to highlight the details that may appear on a quiz or exam. Okay? Okay, so for the education, most of the time, as we went over in the very beginning of the course, a forensic psychologist will have a PhD degree, or we'll see maybe a medical degree, but a PhD in psychology, which means that they're a research scientist that focuses on a certain set of psychology. Now, when I say it can be a specific degree, there are some programs that offer a PhD in forensic psychology, A lot of programs will be a PhD in psychology with a specialization. Like I think Florida International University, and I haven't checked these in a while, Florida International University offered a PhD in psychology with a focus on or concentration in forensic psychology. I think down at Alabama in Tuscaloosa, they offer a PhD in psychology with a focus on law and criminal behavior, something along those lines. So there's a lot of, and really when it comes down to getting into the field, a lot of it depends on the professors and the areas that you do research in, sort of who your mentors are as far as getting into the field. But once an individual is in a field and is working for an agency, many times they will go through a certification process, and that's certification of an individual, where they will show the American Board of Forensic Psychologists their education, any publications, their work experience, and it's where this group will say, yes, you do have all the necessary requirements to go into court and testify, as opposed to just sort of being a self-taught, self-proclaimed, profiler that wrote a couple books, and then you're in court testifying, but you might not have any, or experience or education in the field. Okay, so this is the first sort of true, false, bullet point, multiple choice type question. What is the difference between psychology and psychiatry? Okay, because there are forensic psychologists, there are also forensic psychiatrists, and they do similar things. Now, the difference between psychology and psychiatry, I'm going to read the definition to you and then sort of give you the example here. Let's go out of the field of forensic science for a second and just stick to clinical psychology. Okay, so think of you're going to somebody for help with a certain problem. All right, the science that deals with mental processes and behavior. Okay, so if you're dealing with depression and you go to a forensic psychologist, they may ask you about the mental processes and behavior, sort of, what do you do when you're depressed? What are you thinking about when you're depressed? What is in your past that, may be leading you to feel this certain way? It's all about the stuff that's happened to you and the actions that you're taking, okay? Mental process and behavior. PhD in psychology, and of course they could help you out. If you go to a clinical psychiatrist, notice that psychiatry is the branch of medicine that deals with the treatment of mental disorders. For a forensic psychiatrist, they may focus more on, is there a chemical imbalance of, dopamine or serotonin level or something in your brain that is leading to this excessive depression, or if it's something like psychosis or bipolar disorder. Psychiatrists are medical doctors, and so they sort of approach it more from a chemical imbalance, and they're more likely to prescribe medication to help that. Okay, so psychology, processes and behavior, psychiatry, branch of medicine. Okay, so understand that those are the difference between the two. So a psychiatrist, we went over, a psychologist will have a PhD degree. A psychiatrist will have a medical degree. Okay, so they will be, well, I guess they're all doctors, but they will be a medical doctor, an MD. Now here is a fun true false, not fun, but a potential true false question. Before the 1980s, in the court system, as far as bringing in a professional to testify about psychological matters, the courts thought that psychiatrists were more qualified because they had this medical degree. So it was more common to bring in psychiatrists to testify as opposed to psychologists. Well, in the 1980s, they began to realize that research scientists who weren't necessarily medical doctors, with PhDs in psychology, they actually had a lot of valuable information that could help the jury with determining and answering these questions about, sanity and competency, et cetera, et cetera. So now it's where both forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists are found in the court systems, whereas before the 1980s, it was more typical to find a forensic psychiatrist, according to your book. Okay. That's the end of psychology versus psychiatry, and we're moving on to a whole new topic now, eyewitness testimony. Okay, eyewitness testimony, it's thought of in the court system as being a very strong piece of testimony because the jury can easily relate to the expert witness who is just a person like you or me. And somebody gets on the stand and says, well, I guess technically they're not an expert witness or an expert in witnessing the crime. Okay, so let me get my terminology correct. Okay, an eyewitness, they're just like you and me. They get on the stand and they say, "Yeah, I was at walking into the bank when this man walked out of the bank. He took off his mask. I saw his face, and he's sitting right there." And they point at the defendant. Well, the jury can say, "Oh, okay, I know how that works. If he says that, if the witness says that they saw the defendant, then I believe him because I see people and I remember them as well." Well, early research where the forensic psychologist came in is they found that sometimes eyewitness accounts may not be as reliable as we think they are, as the common juror might think they are. Um, well, I forget if I still have a multiple choice question about this second Buckhout study. There was one study that stated that identification by eyewitness is faulty. What does that say? Faulty 90% of the time. I'm sliding around my chat box here. Is faulty 90% of the time. That probably means that there were some errors. I didn't look at the exact study as far as it doesn't mean that eyewitnesses get on the stand and say it's that guy and they're wrong 90% of the time. But in what they were measuring in their study, they found errors 90% of the time. Both of these research studies, along with many, many others that went with it, just began to identify the problem of eyewitness testimony not being as reliable as conventional wisdom suggested. Okay, and part of that is we as humans tend to think of our brains as sort of like a videotape recorder. So we're recording everything, and then if we're asked to remember something, all we need to do is hit the rewind button, we rewind it, and then hit the play button, and we can envision it exactly as the event occurred. But what the research shows is that individuals can be influenced with their memories, and they may be very convinced that they remembered something that actually wasn't true. So flaws in eyewitness testimony, this doesn't mean that a person gets on the stand and intentionally lies because they want to put the person in jail, either for to help out the prosecution or because they have a grudge against. This is where it's sort of unintentional errors. They believe they're telling the truth, but they're actually flawed in the way they remember something. Okay, because the human brain does not work like a video recorder. One study, I forget the exact name, but they managed to convince individuals that when they were younger, they visited Disneyland and they got their picture taken with Bugs Bunny while they were at Disneyland. And, they would get the person to say, yes, I definitely remember it very clearly that I got my picture taken with Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. But of course, that's impossible because Bugs Bunny is a Looney Tunes character and doesn't exist at Disneyland. So they're sort of mistaken in their recollection. In the forensic field, what the research on eyewitness testimony has shown is that sometimes the law enforcement procedures can influence a person, and sort of the same thing as seeing Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. It can help, or well, not help the person, but it can lead the person to think they remember seeing something or someone that they didn't actually see. Now, if we'll jump to the last bullet there, the DNA Innocence Project is a project where they would go back for people who were incarcerated. They could, submit their case to the DNA Innocence Project, and the Innocence Project would pay to go back and test biological evidence that was collected before DNA analysis was possible. Modern DNA analysis was developed in the mid to late 90s. Okay, after OJ. In the OJ case, they did a type of DNA analysis, but it's not exactly the same type that we do today. And OJ in 1994. Sorry, I should clarify that. So any big case that had biological evidence, maybe from late 70s up to the mid 90s, it's very possible that biological evidence was collected but never processed. So a good example of this would be a rape case where they collected a vaginal swab, but they didn't do DNA analysis on it. Well, they convict a person for rape in, let's say, 1992, and then 10 to 15 years later, through the DNA Innocence Project, they win an appeal to have that evidence tested for DNA. And when the lab does the DNA analysis, they find that it matches the DNA of somebody else in the database, but not the person who was convicted of a crime. And they look at the details to find that, oh, okay, the DNA it matches is a person who's currently in prison for rape, and they were free at the time of that this crime occurred in 1992, and they were also in the same geographic location. And guess what? The two people look very similar. The person who was falsely incarcerated and the person who was actually guilty of the crime. Well, with the DNA Innocence Project, once they identify these errors where innocent people were put into prison, not only is it good as far as releasing the innocent, but also they can go back and look at the case and find out what happened in the case that led to that innocent person being convicted of that crime. And in many cases, it was where it was eyewitness testimony was the big piece of evidence where a witness got on the stand and said, yes, I saw that man, coming out of the alley or coming out of the hotel or coming out of wherever where the rape victim was. And it turns out that they got it wrong. Okay, now how did they get it wrong? Well, if we backtrack to bullet number 3 here, if you've witnessed somebody, and maybe you weren't paying attention, you're just walking down the street, and then you saw somebody, come out of a store, and then you walk further down the street, and then you hear somebody scream, so you go back and you find that a crime had been committed, and the person you walked by earlier was in fact the rapist. So law enforcement comes to you and says, oh, did you see this guy? And they let you know, listen, we don't have any other evidence on this guy. If you can identify him and go on the stand and say, yes, that is the man that I saw coming out of the store, then we're going to be able to convict him of the rape. If not, he's going to get away with it, So you're sort of put as a witness in this position of, man, if I don't remember correctly, then I'm going to let a rapist go free. And the way law enforcement sometimes would present the witness with information about the suspect is they would have mugshots, like little pictures, and they would lay them out in front of the eyewitness and say, can you tell me which one you saw coming out of the alley? And, imagine you're the witness and there's 10 pictures there and you go, well, it sort of looks like, maybe 3, but maybe it was 7. And then law enforcement goes, oh, so you think it looks like 7? And they sort of slide it out in front of you. And they may lead the eyewitness to sort of, convince themselves that, yes, I definitely saw 7. Because you're sitting there as the eyewitness thinking, well, the police think it's number 7. So they probably got some good indications that that's the guy. And I'm the only person that can get on the stand and say that I saw him. So this leads to people really, and not just getting up there and lying because they want to help the police, but sometimes they're really convinced themselves that, yeah, this is definitely the person I saw. And it just turns out that they're wrong. Okay. So because of that, law enforcement, they sort of change the way that law enforcement behaves when interviewing eyewitnesses in order to reduce the possibility of false identification using eyewitness testimony. Okay. Some related topics to the eyewitness testimony is, like I just mentioned, the National Institute of Justice has these guidelines that are publicly available for law enforcement that helps them avoid the mistakes that they learned through the DNA Innocence Project. Ear witness testimony falls under the same category. A person may think that they hear somebody with a certain specific voice, but they might be mistaken. Also, on the topic of eyewitness testimony, believing something isn't true are these false confessions. So this is just worth briefly noting. When I first started studying forensic science and stuff, or early on before I learned anything about false confessions, I thought false confessions are both. It's just somebody confess to a crime and then they change their mind because they want to beat it in court. Actually they're guilty. Who would confess to a crime that they didn't commit? That doesn't make any sense to me. And I convinced myself, I would never confess to a crime that I didn't commit. Okay, that was my stance. But as you learn more about the research that goes into people who claim false confessions and the reason that they confess to a crime that they didn't commit, they found this pattern where if an individual is put in a situation where they feel like the only way out, they're being questioned by police. They come in and they're doing their thing of where they're telling them, listen, we know that you committed this crime. It starts off all friendly. You're helping out the officers, and then they turn on the heat and say, we know you committed this crime. We have evidence to get you. You better confess to this crime to help reduce your sentence, et cetera, et cetera. And instead of asking for an attorney, they sort of feel trapped, and they feel like, okay, I'm just going to, they want me to sign this I'm going to sign this confession, and then I'm going to get my attorney, and then we're going to work it all out as far as, how parts of this story are true. And, maybe I wasn't supposed to be in the store at the time. I was robbing it, but I didn't kill anybody, that type of stuff. So they may confess to a crime that they didn't commit just because they feel pressure and they feel that there's no way to move this forward. I'm going to be in here forever, unless they just confess, and then they can move on to the next step. All right, so it is possible for a person put in the right situation to confess to a crime that they didn't commit. Okay, this is Killing Time. This is a bar, an actual bar in Pell City. I drive by it quite often when I'm visiting my mother-in-law, although I've never gone in. I think their motto is, you come for the margaritas, you stay because you're dead. But let's say that this is an example of eyewitness testimony. Okay, is everybody paying attention here? All right. So the three of you that are in the chat room, this is the participation part. Let's pretend you're walking into Killing Time and you see this guy leaving Killing Time. Okay. Oh, there he is. All right, and then you see another guy. All right, and we're more concerned about that first guy that you saw. Okay, like not these guys, but the first guy you saw. Okay, that very first picture that flashed briefly. What do you guys remember about that guy? Like, look at this thing and see if you can tell me. Like, type in, blue eyes, or type in, spiked hair. Type in goatee. Was he wearing any jewelry? Let's see if between the three of you we can fill out. And for you watching at home, do the same thing. Write down, and don't rewind it. That's cheating, okay? But just write down on a piece of paper, okay, some information about that guy that was in the first picture. Like, do we remember the race of the individual? Do we remember anything about his hair color? So take a few minutes to sort of write down some stuff, and then we're going to see how correct you are. Okay, because what happened is right after we saw that guy, we saw a couple of other people as well. And this, example is not perfect or anything. Okay. All right. All right. So we got Chris playing along. All right. So we got some good stuff in here now. All right. So we have white, receding hairline, some facial hair. We have Caucasian male, brown hair, 45 years old. Okay. So in class, we go into the list a little bit more in depth. I don't want to beat a dead horse here. So let's go to the next slide. All right, guys, what do you guys think? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. Who was the first person? All right, Melanie, Chris. Yeah, and every year, every semester, I say, okay, I'm going to get new pictures, and I'm going to make them so they're a little bit different and not exactly the same. Okay, but you guys are right. I mean, it was number 7. In class, we usually take a vote, and there's a couple people that weren't quite paying attention, and they remember some of the second people they saw, like wasn't it number 5 or something like that. But yeah, it's number 7. And so just sort of as you go through this, you realize that maybe he didn't look exactly like I remember him. And again, you can sort of go through this in everyday life. Look at a person and then try to describe them later. All right. Okay, moving on from eyewitness testimony. Next topic. How is forensic psychology different from clinical psychology? And why do forensic psychologists need to have special training and special research skills and special experience? Why can't you just bring in a clinical psychologist into the forensic field and start testifying? All right. The main differences are, an example I was giving classes, suppose that you're having a problem with anxiety during exams. So you go visit a psychologist, school psychologist through UAB Health Student Services. What is it called? Something Health or anyhow. So you go and you meet with a counselor. All right. It's a psychologist. All right. It's going to be probably a friendly relationship. When they ask you questions, you're going to answer truthfully. Okay. And you're both sort of working as a team to help address and identify the problem and some possible solutions to it. Okay. So the relationship between the psychologist and the patient is a friendly one. Okay. In a forensic setting, if the forensic psychologist has to interview a person who's they're trying to determine if they're competent to stand trial, if they're legally insane, if they were insane at the time of the crime, which was at a different time period than what they're interviewing them, that presents a lot of specific challenges. Okay, number one, it sort of may become more of an adversarial relationship where the forensic psychologist or the patient, in this case the suspect, is sort of working against trying to convince the psychologist that they are insane or they're not competent or et cetera, et cetera. And also, if it's just getting more information about the case or reasons why, then you have the suspect who may proclaim innocence and not be at all truthful about what actually happened in a certain situation. If they're claiming self-defense and it was where they were trapped by a person, then they may be sort of claiming that they felt like their life was, threatened and that they were being held against their will, when in fact that might not be the case. All right. So it's a lot different, and because of that, you can't necessarily just bring in a clinical psychologist to do these forensic evaluations. All right. So with psychological testing, as with all testing in the forensic field, you try to remove a lot of the subjectivity to it. But it's almost impossible to remove subjectivity in a forensic setting, because when we're dealing with humans and human psychology, every person is a little bit different. So it's not as though you can give somebody the insanity test, a list of 50 multiple choice questions, and then at the end they get a score, and if they're above a 45, then you're insane or something like that. But for clinical psychology, there are some tests that you go to a test in Cosmo, do you have a healthy relationship, or which Sex and the City character are you? Although I guess that really doesn't apply to forensic psychology, but do you have a healthy relationship? And you answer 15 questions, and then you get a score of flaming bed versus, I don't know, chili ice cube. I don't read Cosmo. I don't know if Cosmo still exists, and I don't know if these quizzes are present. But it's just an example of sort of a simple quiz that may, in a clinical setting, sort of lead to a discussion that you can have between your psychologist and yourself about different areas. But in the forensic field, tests like this don't address legal issues, and they might not be accurate for everybody. So, in a multiple choice question trying to identify whether you have signs of anxiety or not, it may be where if you score, an 85 on this quiz, then you have a 90% chance of having levels of anxiety that require treatment. That 90% or 70%, that's not good in a psychological setting. The jury needs to know the opinion of the forensic psychologist. Okay, was this person, competent to waive their Miranda rights at the time they waived them in the investigation? Okay. Also, as I mentioned before, in a forensic setting, sometimes if you're dealing with temporary insanity, you may be trying to evaluate whether a person was insane at the time of a crime that happened 2 months ago. And that is very difficult to do just with, a simple multiple choice test. All right. Now, I mentioned multiple choice tests, but there are other tests that clinical psychologists do use. So we are going to go through these where is I don't know how we're going to do this. So we are going to go through these as a class, or you at home can play along at home. And what we're going to do is we are going to look at an ink blot, And then I'm going to read you the interpretation. So you know how this goes. And first of all, I need to get out of this because I need to discard. Okay, we need to get right here. I'm moving around because I need to also get my answers. All right, so I know that you guys cannot see anything right now, but don't worry, that's going to be fixed in a second. All right, and there we go. Okay, chat room, help me out. Even though it looks a little bit different, can you see the first ink blot? Because I should be, okay, good. All right, so what I want you guys to do is tell me, what does that ink blot look like? All right, and while you're thinking, giving your answers in the chat box, or while you're thinking at home and giving an answer on a piece of paper, I just want to know, these ink blots, you know, when I first heard about ink blots, I thought, oh, a psychologist just squirts ink on a card and folds it in half and then, you know, shows it to you and you say it looks like your mother. But in fact, the Rorschach ink blots were specific shapes, and there were 10 cards, and they were studied thoroughly to where each had a certain interpretation that went along with it. And a lot of psychologists who use this ink blot test got a little upset when the internet came about because it was good for nothing, right? And people began to read about these ink blot tests and they sort of knew the answers. So they become less effective now if somebody actually studies and knows what answer they're supposed to give. All right. All right. So we see fox face. All right. Okay. So now that everybody has their information down, now you might not be able to see the screen right now, but that's okay. Actually, can I make this any smaller? Let me move this. Come on. Is that going to work? Hey, there we go. All right. Sorry, my tiny computer screen that I'm working on is getting very crowded with stuff here. All right. The first blot is easy. How fast you answer is taken as an indication of how well you cope with new situations. The best reaction to give is one of the most common responses immediately. Good answers are bat, butterfly, moth, mask, jack-o'-lantern, and animal face. So I would think fox face sort of falls into that. Are common responses too. In some interpretation schemes, they suggest paranoia. So I'm not and I should mention also, the first time I did this, I didn't proofread the interpretations, and I inadvertently accused the entire class of being homosexual. So just keep in mind that these are not the end-all be-all of interpretation. Okay. So I'm not saying that you guys are paranoid, or am I? All right, let's move on to the next blot here. Okay. And some of these have a little bit of color in them as well. All right, so you guys at home, take a look. For those of you watching live, take a look and go ahead and throw in the chat box here. What does this second ink blot look like? And I will take a bite of food while you guys decide. All right. 2 elves high-fiving, or 2 animals high-fiving. Okay. All right, usually this blot is seen as 2 human figures, usually females or clowns. Let's see here. If you have trouble seeing the human figures, it might be taken as a sign you have trouble relating to people. You can give other responses as well, such as cave entrance or butterfly. And that's it. All right. All right, let's do a couple more. Now, the reason we're doing this is because at the end here, and also during the interpretations, we're supposed to see how these interpretations, they may lead to conversations with your clinical psychologist about problems you're having or issues you've had in the past. But it's sort of difficult to apply these to a forensic setting, right? Okay, ooh, I like that. Oh, wait. I'm on the wrong page. Okay, 2 lambs doing pottery. A neckline with a bow tie. Oh, okay, I can see that. Sort of zoomed in on the neck. It's pretty good. All right. So where am I at here? All right. Oh, okay, yeah, this is the dangerous one here. All right, so this is the blot that supposedly can determine sexual preference. All right, but I don't think we've gotten to this point yet. Okay, most people can be led to see the 2 humans figures. Now, if you see the figures, don't answer this in the chat box. Okay, I don't want to know. But it says once you see the 2 figures, if you don't volunteer the gender of the figures, you'll be asked to specify it. So in other words, the psychologist would ask you, well, do you think those 2 people holding the pot or holding whatever facing each other, are they male or female? Both have prominent breasts and an equally prominent penis. By the traditional interpretation, seeing the figures as male is a heterosexual response. Describing the figures as female or acknowledging the androgynous nature of the blot is supposed to be a homosexual response. Does it work? Not really. Many straights describe the figures as women, and not all gays give a gay response. A 1971 study showed that the traditional heterosexual response to male figures seemed to be declining in popularity. My favorite is, because they don't really mention the splotches of red ink that are perceived separately, but my favorite is somebody said, oh yeah, it's 2 guys thinking about New Zealand, which is what they thought that little red thing was. Okay, next slide. Take a look at this one. Just kind of weird. And I'll start to lead you guys here. So plate 4 is the father card. At first glance, it's difficult to see as a single image. But then, once the boots are pointed out, they become fairly conspicuous. Many subjects see the blot as an animal skin. After a few seconds, though, most can see it as a standing figure seen from below. Yeah, like a 3-legged man with crab hands, right? The boots become feet, enlarged because of the unusual perspective. The arms and head at the top are smaller. Common descriptions are bear, gorilla, or man in a heavy coat. Bad descriptions are monster or attacking bear or gorilla. And theorists equate your description of the figure with your perception of your father or male authority figures. So if you see an attacking bear, then it tends to suggest that you may have been fearful of your father or male authority figures. I don't know what crab hands means. It may have maybe it means that your father was a crab. I don't want to make any assumptions, Melanie. So if you did have a crab father, that's fine. A ram-headed god wearing a long dress. Well, Carolyn, I would love to meet your father. Okay. Let's go to plate 5 here. All right. Chris Johnson, a bat. Rorschach himself thought this was the easiest blot to interpret. It is a bat or a butterfly, period. You don't want to mention anything else. Seeing the projections on the ends of the bats as crocodile heads signifies hostility. Seeing the paired butterfly antenna as feet or scissors signifies a castration call. Okay, we don't want to get into that. Oh, I like this one. Schizophrenics sometimes see moving people in this blot. So if you did look at this blot and say, hey, what are those guys doing in there? Then, maybe you should schedule an appointment. Ooh, I like that. Elephant-legged bunny with wings. That's kind of terrifying. Like a flying, like there's a certain point where bunnies go from being really cute to terrifying. And I think a bunny with really gigantic wings, that would be kind of terrifying. Really anything flying gets a little bit scary. Okay, is that it? Oh no, we got one more here. Wait, Caroline, do you have a fun fact about bunnies? Wait, are you two watching this in the same room, like across the room from each other? Sorry for for those that you can't see. Okay, go ahead. This is the most complicated one, so everybody focus on interpreting this ink blot. In the chat room, Melanie has just suggested. Oh, okay. I thought that Melanie was saying that Caroline had a bunch of bunny fun facts for us, but it turns out that Caroline just has a bunny, and that in itself is a fun fact. Okay. Thought Caroline might have been like a bunny expert. Fun fact, bunnies are actually not that soft. You know, like one of those. That's not fun at all. Okay, are you ready for this? The most difficult blot. All right, the rest of this blot doesn't really look like much of anything. Some hold the value of this blot is to have the subject grope for images and possibly reveal subconscious attitudes. The secret of this plate is to turn it. So if you turn your head there, all right, a cloaked man with a large dagger on his head. All right, and Caroline has confirmed she does have a bunny. Okay, the ink blot, cloaked man with a large dagger. The bunny, not necessarily in the ink blot. If you turn your head and look at it from the side, it sort of looks like a submarine with a reflection. And if you turn it upside down, it looks a little bit like a mushroom cloud. So sometimes the forensic psychologist will have the subject turn these and see the different images as it turns. All right. Okay. That's it for ink blots. Yeah, I always think of the statue in Brazil on what do they call it? Like Brazilian Jesus. That's not right. But anyhow, all right. Four-armed man on the top of a mountain. Yeah. Okay. So for these ink blot tests, you can see how it sort of spurs some thinking, spurs a conversation, and based on your answers, a skilled psychologist can sort of lead into a discussion of maybe areas that the subject is uncomfortable talking about. So it's sort of a good jump off point for conversations and psychological treatment. All right, another example of this is the thematic application test. I couldn't remember what the first word is, where you're shown a picture and you make up a story about it. Okay, so let's go through a couple examples of these, and you're going to find a common theme through this. Okay, so I show you this picture, and I ask you what's going on, and I'm going to go back to the full screen here. All right, so if I show you this picture, I want you guys to give me a quick 1 to 2 sentence description of what's going on in this picture. And again, this is mainly for discussions with a clinical psychologist, not so good for forensic psychology. Okay, so Melanie says he's trying to read the mind of the instrument. All right, is it Chris? I'm looking at C Edge, and for some reason I want to say Chris, but I think I'm getting you confused with somebody in another class. All right, I'll call you C. Connor. All right. So Melanie says he's trying to read the mind of the instrument. Connor says a boy looking at a violin. All right. Caroline says the kid is upset because his parents made him take the violin's lessons. Okay. All right. So for Connor, the psychologist may ask you about, well, tell me something about the boy. You say a boy looking at a violin. Tell me something about a boy. And what they'll try to get at is for you to start to talk in terms that, like Carolyn mentioned, where you sort of put yourself in the position of the boy and what that the person is feeling. So in other words, it's not just describing what's in the picture, but how the person in the picture is feeling. And sometimes it's sort of where you're putting yourself in that position, so they may talk, you may be describing somebody else, but talking a little bit about yourself as well. All right, so let's do the same thing with this picture. All right, I show you this picture, and I ask you, okay, what's going on in this picture? All right, and as you begin to answer and develop the 1 to 2 sentence story, what the psychologist will ask you about is, okay, well, if you mention something about the boy and you don't offer it right off the bat, well, tell me about the boy. What is he thinking? What is he doing there? Et cetera, et cetera. And most of the time you see this picture and it looks like, a big house and it's a small boy. It doesn't look like it's, a luxury hotel or anything. So you may say that, the child is sad, or it's, Great Depression, so they have nothing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so you say, you stay on that step and you watch your brothers and sisters play. All right. Oh, this is a good one. I think we only have 2 more though, so this does not go on forever. All right, so somebody give me a quick, whoever gets in first, give me a quick. All right, man died, woman upset. Good job, Connor. That is that is actually a great 4-word novel, right? Man died, woman upset. Yeah, so in class we have and the key here is you see the woman, you recognize she's upset about something, sort of put yourself in her position and you recognize those feelings in the woman. If you have trouble relating to the woman and seeing that she's upset, then that may lead the psychologist to talk about issues as far as how you feel. Some people say that he's in bed with another woman, or he's passed out drunk and she's upset because he's drunk again. So you can make up your own story there. All right, I think we might have one more. Is this? Oh, wait a minute. No, that's a mistake. That should not have been in that set of pictures. All right, so you get the general idea. All right, you're shown a picture, you make up a story, it gets you to talk about the people in the story. Great for clinical psychology as far as where you're talking about a person's how they feel. But it's not as though a forensic psychologist, if you're determining competency to stand trial, can show you a picture of, like a courtroom and say, tell me about the judge, what is the judge thinking, or how does the defendant feel, to determine whether they're competent to stand trial. They have to do it in a little bit more, I don't know, direct, or I don't know what it would be, but in a different manner. Okay, it's not as easy. There's also something, projective figure drawings that the book mentions that clinical psychologists can use. Draw me a happy family. And then based on, if it's drawn with 2 people with knives shooting out of their eyeballs, then that may lead to a conversation about trouble in the family. Okay, so for these psychological tests with, in the courtroom, like a personality test or similar to clinical tests that we just talked about, where you might be able to assign a personality disorder or some, signs of anxiety or schizophrenia or depression. You might be able to address those with the clinical test, but for forensic applications, how do you design a test to test things like competency to stand trial, waive Miranda rights, or legal insanity? And it's much more difficult to do. Okay, so what is the point of doing all that? Well, number one, at the end of the semester, especially for an on-campus class, is just sort of a light lecture to have a discussion. But also it sort of highlights how clinical psychology is a little bit different from forensic psychology as far as the type of tests and procedures you can use. Okay, so we're going to move on to a different topic here, and this may be like a 1-slide topic. For sexual offenders, treatment versus prison, this may be the opposite of what we might think, where the 1930s through the 1970s, many states mandated where if a person was convicted of a sex offense that maybe wasn't, so we're not necessarily talking about rape here, but maybe like public exposure, peeping toms, groping in public, they mandated that these individuals should be evaluated and treated by a psychologist, to help them deal with their issues, and then they would be deemed suitable for release, and they would be released. But what the psychologist who studied this found was that many of those individuals who were released would be back in prison for committing the same type of crimes or for escalating the types of crimes. So, in other words, it was found that for certain types of sex offenses, the treatment just wasn't working. So the courts actually switched to a more longer term incarceration. And this isn't to say that they just discontinue treatment, period, but they switched to a longer term incarceration for these individuals. All right. All right. Altered states of so again, now we're on to another topic here. All right. So for narcoanalysis and hypnosis, neither of these are useful for recalling facts as far as helping an eyewitness remember exactly what went on, or helping somebody who can't remember, maybe somebody who was assaulted and has blocked that out, helping them recall, what actually happened. Yeah, in some cases, well, Dr. Linville, I was hypnotized and then I remembered where my car keys were. All right, yeah, sometimes in a clinical setting, hypnosis or narcoanalysis, which is truth serum or sodium amytal, but it helps you relax and then answer questions. Sometimes that can help a person remember certain things, but it's not as though they are magic where you're going to start recalling facts or, spouting out truth. So it's not like you can dope somebody up and say, did you murder this person? And you're going to get a accurate answer. Okay. If you're determined to lie, you're going to lie. If you want to tell the truth, you'll tell the truth. All right. So psychologists, evaluate these. This sort of skips ahead from what we were talking about the clinical versus forensic tests, where psychologists and psychiatrists are involved with trying to assess these issues. And the way they do it is through examination of the subject and also examination of their previous records. So it's sort of like the medical examiner, the forensic pathologist, where it's not just the autopsy is what they base their opinion on, but it's evaluation of the subject and then also looking at their past history. This is especially important if you're trying to determine temporary insanity, where you can evaluate the person today, look at their medical records or their psychological records from the psychiatrist over the past 5 years, and then determine if, okay, 2 months ago, were they insane at the time that they committed a specific crime? All right. A myth of competency to stand trial is, if you're determined that you're not competent to stand trial, then they let you go. No, that's not quite the case. What it will be is where, since the defendant has to understand the charges in order to stand trial, then if subjects determined where they're not competent to stand trial, they don't really understand what they've been arrested for, the crime that they committed, what will happen during trial if they're convicted of the crime. Then if that's the case where the person is not competent to stand trial, they will receive treatment until they're competent, and then they will be put on trial. If it's several years where they've been undergoing treatment and the psychologist determined that they're never going to be competent to stand trial, they're never going to understand what they did or the consequences of what happens in a trial, then they're deemed incompetent, but they're not released they're not freed. It's just they enter a more permanent treatment facility. Okay. Legal insanity. So this is, again, we're moving on to, in the same area, but a separate topic here. The McNaughton rule, and a lot of people get these two cases sort of confused, so I want to make clear that these are two separate things. Okay, the McNaughton rule was established in England in 1843, a very long time ago, and this was the concept that if a person did not know what he or she was doing was wrong, by either mental illness or other reason, then they should not receive the same punishment as a person who knew what they were doing was wrong and did it anyway. Okay, so the verdict that was handed down was not guilty by insanity. And again, this doesn't mean that they're not guilty and that they're let go and they're let free, but it's just a different level of treatment and incarceration than a person who is just found to be guilty of knowing what they were doing. All right. This came into play in 1981 with John Hinckley Jr., who was attempted assassination of President Reagan. His attempt was, or in part, he was doing it to impress the actress Jodie Foster. But you can read about John Hinckley Jr. Very recently, he was released from prison. But at the time in 1981, he was found guilty but mentally ill. He was found not guilty by insanity. And this upset many people because, he just tried to assassinate the president and he's found not guilty because he's insane. That's not right. So some states adopted the verdict guilty but mentally ill. Now, in many ways, guilty but mentally ill and not guilty by insanity, the same thing would happen to the individual where these verdicts were handed down. Okay, the difference was just whether it was not guilty or guilty, but they, even if you're not guilty by insanity, you still have to undergo permanent treatment. So John Hinckley Jr., guilty but mentally ill, he was found not guilty by insanity, but the states who were upset about that adopted guilty but mentally ill. So right now, today, you'll find some states have a not guilty by insanity verdict, some states have a guilty but mentally ill, but both of those rely on this concept that was established by the MacNaughton Rule that people who did not know what they were doing was wrong should be treated differently than people who know fully well what they're doing is wrong and commit it anyway. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit into profiling MO versus signature. Modus operandi is a criminal's way of operating, and so this is all categories, all descriptions of the case. Now, within the modus operandi is a trademark or a signature, which is an unusual act. Okay, so it's sort of this logic thing here where a signature is part of the modus operandi, but in itself, because it's unusual, it's referred to as a signature. So if the modus operandi was we have a pair of burglars who are breaking into the homes of rich people while they're on vacation, they're doing it at night, they steal jewelry and valuables, and when they leave the faucets running to overflow the sinks. Okay. Everything I just described is part of the modus operandi because it's all the characteristics of the case, of the crime that they committed. But the signature would be leaving those faucets running, okay, the water bandits, okay, because that's an unusual act that's in the connection with the crime, like, tarot cards for tarot card killer, et cetera, putting little letters underneath the fingernails of victims, that would be a signature. Okay, another example of that. By the way, I hope the water bandits don't try to rob a case where there's a child who has been left home alone, because I'm sure that would have dire and hilarious consequences. If a bunch of housewives are turning up dead, and every time a housewife is murdered, a bouquet of flowers with a letter is left at the scene that says, "Honey, it's an I cut myself shaving bouquet." Since this is an online lecture, I will not go into a full description of who Merlin Olsen was and why he would be leaving bouquets. But the modus operandi, murder is usually done during the day, no forced entry, sharp tool, no weapon left behind, flowers and card left behind. Notice the flowers and card are part of the modus operandi, but if you're asked what is the signature is just the flowers and card is the signature. It's an unusual act that's in connection of a crime. Okay, for profiling, so this is a slightly different topic than the MO versus signature. Profiling looks at the characteristics of a crime, and this usually deals with serial crimes. Typically, we think of as serial killers, murders that have certain characteristics that are similar to each other. But the profiling is where you look at the traits of the crime, and you come up with a profile of what the murderer, in the case of a serial killer, what the murderer is like, and you get jokes about how, it's a serial killer. It's probably a male Caucasian who's kind of a loner, in his late 20s to early 40s. with a military background. You know, this seems to be the easy profile to go to. But there can be some variation. It's never where they get a specific, like on this one episode of Criminal Minds, they determined that he had a menial job and he had a stutter. You know, this was like their profile. And then Mandy Patinkin's in a gas station and the clerk goes, here's your change, you know, and then they all start shooting people. So it's usually not that specific, but it's a matter of it can help law enforcement narrow down their suspects and sort of focus their investigation. The FBI on the show Criminal Minds, the FBI does have a behavioral science unit, and it began when psychologists, profilers met with law enforcement agents, and they sort of began discussing these serial cases, and they found that the psychologists actually were very beneficial to the investigation and helped the investigators sort of narrow the pool of suspects down. So because of this, the FBI now has a permanent behavioral science unit where they employ forensic psychologists who specialize in profiling to help with the investigation. The National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime also has forensic psychologists who will accept cases and work them for law enforcement agencies. The thing about profiling is it's important to remember that it's an investigative tool and it can't be used in court. So in other words, if you come up with a profile of, you know, I think this serial killer is Caucasian, you know, in his 30s or 40s, probably an academic, works at a university, drives a black Saturn that now has 4 hubcaps, you know, and it fits me and they focus the investigation on me, they can gather other evidence that suggests I'm guilty of the crime. But when I go into court, they can't put that psychologist up there and says, well, we determined that the suspect was white male, and then start describing me, because that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The only reason they arrest me is because of that profile. Well, the profile could be completely wrong, so you can't then use that to convict the person. Okay, so again, it's used by the law enforcement as an investigation, but it's not used in court. Okay, and that is the end of it. All right, so right now, if Connor, Caroline, or Melanie, if you guys have any questions for me, feel free to throw them in the chat box. It can be about this lecture. It can be about upcoming quizzes or examens, wrapping up the course or whatever. I'm going to leave the recording running a little bit longer in case you guys ask a relevant question. But if not, then I'll stop the recording and you guys can ask me about anything that you don't want to be recorded as well. But at this point, since I have you both down for attendance, you can jump out of the room and you'll receive attendance for the course. All right, thank you for listening. Thanks, Connor. All right, I'm going to leave the recording running for this question. Melanie asked if there's a big job market for a forensic psychologist, and I've been slowly trying to dig up more information about this, Melanie. I think somebody else in the class, I think Olivia, had the same question. I don't know a good way to answer that question because the type of jobs for forensic psychologists are really varied. Like if you want to be a DNA analyst or just a forensic science in general in a lab, then you have the state labs and they'll have a certain number of positions and you'll apply to them. You'll be hired and trained in a certain section. For forensic psychologists, many of them are working within the court system where if you're a counselor that works in corrections to determine whether prisoners are suitable for release, that's sort of in the field of forensic psychology, right? Because it's psychologists working in the forensic field associated with law. But the education and the experience that you might need, and it may be where you just need a master's, it may be where you need a PhD, it may be where you need some experience in corrections before you get that job, it may be where you need some experience outside of that specific job in order to get it. You may need experience as a counselor before you get employed by the correction system. And I'm not sure as far as exactly how many individuals they have doing that job. for if all correction agencies have that same type of counselor job. And then you move out to something like profiling. Well, profiling, there's not a huge field for it. Profiling, you're probably going to get a PhD. You're probably going to be writing books about profiling and serial killers, and you're probably going to be more of an academic working at a university and writing books, and then occasionally get asked to consult on cases. Okay, so there it's where there's probably a lot of jobs available to work in academics conducting that type of research. But as far as the casework, that could vary, where some years you get a lot of casework experience, some years you don't get much. So is that a forensic psychologist? Well, yeah, technically it is, but it's not like it's a full-time forensic psychology job. So and then you could also get a PhD in psychology, focus on eyewitness testimony, get employed by a university where you're writing papers, conducting research studies, where you're bringing people in and, having them go into a room with a bunch of kittens and see if they notice, I don't know, posters on the wall or something. That's a really bad, no, because there would have to be a crime. So you put them in a room with kittens, and then you have somebody come in and take a purse there. And then you record about how well they recognize the person who came in and took the purse. That's a research career. So you're working at a university, teaching classes, conducting research, publishing in scientific journals. But as far as how often you're going to get called into court to testify about eyewitness testimony, that depends. Sometimes with testifying, if you get experience testifying in court, then that leads to testifying in other cases, and it can sort of like accelerate and build to where eventually you're doing much more casework than you are teaching or working in a university. Elizabeth Loftus, if you look up that name for eyewitness testimony, this is sort of a good example of a forensic psychologist who does a lot of research. She visited UAB several years ago, but that's sort of another potential career. All right, so in other words, job market, I always try to find, which is what I'm in the process of doing, try to find individuals who are closer to that field than I am, because I'm not the right person to ask about that. But the two places I always recommend students go are look into the forensic psychology with a concentration in law and something else down at UA in Tuscaloosa. Find some professors involved in that program, and you can maybe send them an email. You might get lucky and they'll give you a response, or you might have to send it 2 or 3 times. The same thing with Florida International University. They have a program down there. So you can look at, academic programs, find some professors who are doing something similar to what you're interested in, and then just send them an email and ask them a little bit about job opportunities. So that's not a great answer, but it's the best I can do. All right. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And then Melanie, if you have any other questions, you can ask off recording. Otherwise, everybody, see you next week.